Thank you. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. I want you all to note the relatively new music that introduced this event. Great uplifting music, sort of like Chariots of Fire theme song, which is very evident and very appropriate for dealing with Ukraine's David struggle against the behemoth of Putin's Russia. And as part of that, we have an absolutely outstanding program for you today. We have a special guest from Kyiv, former Prime Minister, former everything, Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Who, that's true. Well, there's a future still. I must say, I met the Prime Minister when he was fresh out of high school and the young Minister of Economy 20 plus years ago. Truly an extraordinary career in Ukraine. And of course, he played a critical role when Moscow began this war, not 3.5 years ago, but 11.5 years ago. Next to Prime Minister Yatsenyuk is Paula Dobryansky, a former Deputy Undersecretary of State, NSC official, long-time foreign policy maven, largely but not entirely with Republican administrations, also a member of the board of the Atlantic Council. And next to Paul is Doug Lute, not only a retired 3-star general, but a deputy at the NSC, also under multiple presidents, and a board member of the Atlantic Council. And next to Doug is Kim Kagan, who cedes no ground to anyone on this panel when it comes to expertise on Moscow's war on Ukraine and what the world, and especially the United States, should be doing. With that, we're going to let former Prime Minister Yatsenyuk speak for 7 or 8 minutes. We have a very tough timeline, and I'm a tough taskmaster, so please keep it short. And then we'll take questions, and we'll ask questions of our panelists, and after that, you'll have a chance to ask questions. With that, Mr. Minister, over to you. And thank you for being here. Well, it's always great to see you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for making it possible to address this kind of very distinguished audience. So the reason why I'm here, I am on my advocacy mission all over the world. I was in Paris, Warsaw, Stockholm, London, and now DC. And I believe that DC is a kind of very important destination because everyone is looking at you. Whether you are to support Ukraine or, as Russians believe, that the US can turn its back on Ukraine. I would never believe in this, because you are still the leaders of the free world, and you want to lead this world, and you have God's enormous resources to save and to defend an independent and sovereign country, which is Ukraine. And I strongly believe that even your administration, the time will come when they will be eager to make Ukraine a NATO member state. So I am not in the position to preach to the choir, because I believe that those sitting in this very audience do understand the necessity to make bold actions in order to help Ukraine. But I will try to explain what are we reaching, what kind of goals Ukraine has. The main goal is Ukraine's victory. It is all about the definition. Because there were a number of different kind of language we need to take to stand by Ukraine as long as it takes. It is important to stand by Ukraine as long as it takes for Ukraine to win the war. What does it mean in my world to win the war? To win the war, it means to preserve Ukraine's statehood, to preserve Ukrainian nation, to provide an ironclad security guarantees for Ukraine, to provide financial and military support for the Ukrainian state, to make Ukraine an EU member, and to become a full-fledged NATO member in the long run. So these are the set of priorities, which I believe is the most and vital for Ukraine. Whether we can reach this goal? Absolutely. Because this war has been going on for 11 years. And Ukraine did something unbelievable. Practically nobody expected that armed to the teeth Russia will fail to take over Ukraine, both in the last 11 years and 3.5 years after the large-scale invasion. So if you compare the resources of Russia and Ukrainian one, it's definitely Russia outweighs Ukraine. But if you look at the resilience and strength of the Ukrainian military, Ukrainian nation, and Ukraine's allies, we are stronger. And that's what's happening right now on the battlefield. Initially, Russia controlled about 33% of Ukraine's territory. Then Ukrainian military fend off, and as of now, Russia occupies around 20% of Ukrainian territory. Designated war criminal Putin is making an incremental gains right now. And that's the reality. And we are facing tremendous challenges. But Ukraine's nation still maintains very high morale. Under the latest poll that I deliberately prepared before this trip to DC, the question was to the Ukrainian people, so do you still believe in Ukraine's victory over Russia? So 74% still believe in an unconditional victory over Russia, and 58% of Ukrainians believe in the military victory over Russia. Ukrainians are not ready to accept any kind of so-called concessions. And I can elaborate on this just to explain that there is no any kind of concession that Putin will buy. The only concession that Putin is ready to accept is a full and unconditional capitulation and surrender of Ukraine and the Western world. So all these debates over the land swap has nothing with the reality, because it is not a land swap, it is a land grab, and we are not allowed to legitimize this kind of land grab. So what is needed for Ukraine? Military support, an additional security supplemental from the United States, financial support, secondary sanctions imposed both by the United States and the European Union, a joint pressure on China to make China at least neutral, because China is an accomplice. China is a back office that finances this war against Ukraine and the entire democracies. And getting along with those who helped Russia to circumvent sanctions, like India, just to incentivize them to win themselves off the Russian dependence on oil and gas, and to provide alternatives for these kind of countries. This is an action plan that is needed for all of us. And actually, that's the reason why I'm in DC, and I hope that the time will come when the President of the United States, who made an amazing U-turn a few weeks ago, saying that Ukraine can regain its territories with the help of the European Union and NATO. He just missed and the United States, but well, sometimes it happens, and he, as the President of the United States, definitely supports Ukraine's territorial integrity and independence, and he even elaborated on the idea to provide the long-range missiles for Ukraine, Tomahawks. So I strongly believe that this administration will deliver on these promises. And I strongly believe that Ukraine is to win. Ukraine will defend the free world, and the free world is standing by the Ukraine with all its might and force. That's it.
Smart and economical, so thank you for that. Okay, you get the first question as a reward. So you've just arrived from Kyiv, and actually via various European capitals. How does Ukraine see the vast changing diplomatic and battlefield situation?
Well, as I already told you, Ambassador, so Russia is making an incremental gains. And the thing is that Russia has a capacity to do it. One of the biggest problems is not just human resources that we are facing, and you are well aware that Russia's population is around 140 million people, and Ukraine's population is around 30+ million people. So, and there is no any kind of conscription or mobilization in Russia. They have just firing squads, and they use their population as a cannon fodder. So it's similar that Soviets did. In Ukraine, we are in a democratic state, and we are facing these kind of challenges and difficulties in getting enough human power. But the thing is that Russia's summer offensive has collapsed and failed. Putin is preparing for the winter offensive, and it is to be a kind of combination, both military offensive on the front lines and drone and missile attacks on Ukrainian energy sector, heating facilities, electricity grids, and infrastructure. So he believes that time is playing into his hands, And the only way to make him, to press him to change his calculus is to show to Putin that, look, you are very serious in helping Ukraine, that there is a new security supplemental, and that the decisions to support Ukraine are in the pipe. So the general mood of the Ukrainian population is still very high. And he was aiming actually at undermining Ukraine's morale. He failed in this, and this is unprecedented, because Ukrainians managed to retain this kind of strong unity for 11 years. And this gives us an additional strength in fighting against the Russia. Because please realize, for us, it is an existential issue. It is about life or death. We want to live.
Thank you. Excellent. Paula, we have seen President Trump move a few times regarding the war in Ukraine. He recently said, as we all know, that Ukraine can take back maybe all of the territory Moscow has seized since 2014. What do you make of this latest shift, and how do you expect American policy to develop in the weeks and months to come?
All right.
An easy question.
Yes. Well, first, thank you for coming. We're really honored to have you here today, and just thank you for that very clearly stated remarks. And Ukrainians should be very, very proud of that unity of purpose that you pointed out and referenced. And we're not talking about, as you said, the last 3 years. No, we're talking about since 2014 to the present. So thank you. To answer your question, let me divide it up, John, if I may. John used the word shifts. So let me mention what has shifted and what I think has remained constant. Let me start with what's constant. The fact is, I think that President Trump, before he was elected, and now as President of the United States, I think he genuinely wants peace, peace in Ukraine. And I think he is trying to look at, over these months, all different ways of achieving that, and also giving the benefit of the doubt, as we know, in dialogue in particular with Moscow and with Putin. And in that sense, I think that you can expect that to be a constant and not a shift of that dedication to achieving peace there in Ukraine. And by the way, he also made a statement, I remember taking note of it, I think it might have been before he was inaugurated, where he said, actually dealing with the tragedy in Ukraine and will be a much difficult feat, more so than the Middle East. And certainly, as we have seen, that has had movement and this has not, and not because of Ukraine in this case. The second one that I want to mention is also that he's been steadfast of how to give support. I think the Hague summit over the summer underscored the issue of the commitment in defense spending, 5%, and then secondly, also the way of giving U.S. military aid to be given through our NATO allies, that in this case, that is the way it would be funneled. But I would say that in terms of this consistency, the silver lining is the fact that he has very recently talked about rendering the Tomahawks and other kind of vital long-range equipment which Ukraine has requested and is in need of. So on that score, it's consistent. Aid will go forward, military assistance, but through our NATO allies. As for the shift, let me backtrack a little bit. You know, I think the fact is that it was rather, I'd say, horrifying that even a ceasefire couldn't be respected. If I could say here in this case, I think back that one of the first conversations, this was then Foreign Minister Kuleba had a meeting in Turkey 3 years ago with Lavrov, and they discussed a ceasefire at that time. Well, as we know, there was never a ceasefire then, and there's been no ceasefire now. So that's number one. Number two, there was the Alaska summit. I think when you look at the Alaska summit, was there for President Trump and the administration some significant shift and change on the part of Russia and Putin. Quite tragically, what was going on at that time was actually the attack on Ukraine got upped very significantly, so much so that what was most noteworthy were that innocent people, innocent lives were being lost. This wasn't an aggression on military targets, but it was seen worldwide how so many parts of Ukraine's infrastructure in the sense of where there are innocent people, children who were being killed. And then you come to the incursions into Poland and into Estonia in these cases. And I think where we are now, there is a shift. And the shift is in terms of what President Trump has said. He has said very clearly that we are considering the Tomahawk missiles for Ukraine. He has also come out and stated some criticisms of Putin in this regard, but most significantly was the issue about Ukraine going forward and acquiring all of its territory. And in that sense, I want to pick up on what President Zelensky, I believe, said when he met recently with President Trump, and that just only occurred about a week ago up at the UN, and when he said this is a game changer. That's what he called it. I do see it as a game changer, and a game changer which I believe that President Trump will seize upon for the sake of peace, which he's been committed to, and because he has tried, almost, as we say, turned every stone in terms of dealing with Putin and Moscow, and it has not brought any kind of significant concession here. And on the contrary, it has resulted in an onslaught, an unprecedented onslaught on Ukraine. And for that reason, no, it's a game changer, and it is a significant shift. I see that as having great potential for the administration.
Thank you, Paul. Excellent response. Okay, Kim, in fact, I forgot to mention that Kim is not just the president, she's also the founder of the Institute for the Study of War, which has done the best stuff on the battlefield since this war began. Again, not 3.5 years ago, but 11 years ago. So congratulations for that. Now, as a reward for having done such wonderful work, you get to answer this question. Zooming in on the battlefield, what dynamics are we seeing today on the front lines, especially regarding Ukraine's counteroffensive in Pokrovsk and Dobra Filia, which is not too far away from Pokrovsk?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you. I had the opportunity to do some travel inside of Ukraine to see some different sectors of the battlefield. So what I'd like to start out with is top line. And the top line is that Putin is trying to create a narrative of incessant gain through the small but consistent gains that his forces are making on the battlefield along the 1,200-kilometer front line. And Putin's theory of victory rests on the idea that he will outlast Ukraine and the United States in terms of longevity and support on the battlefield. And so in order to bring Putin to a different calculus, it is really important for Ukraine to be able to continue to withstand Russian attacks and make military gains on the battlefield to prove false Putin's theory of victory. When we actually look at the battlefield up close, it's quite different from what we read in the newspapers. In the newspapers, we hear that the battlefield is like the trench lines of the First World War. That is not true. It is no longer true. What we're seeing is something much more dynamic. And in particular, over the high-intensity sectors of the front line, there isn't really one front line anymore. There is a zone around the the front line that is about 20 kilometers on either side of it, in which the Russians and the Ukrainians have some freedom of movement, and in which there is a huge amount of precision lethality brought by the combination of drones for reconnaissance, drones for fires, and other weapons systems. So in other words, along this 1,200 kilometer stretch, there's 20 kilometers on either side in which the Russians are making small gains and the Ukrainians are countering by making counterattacks to regain territory. What do these things look like? Well, these small gains that the Russians are making, including the gain that Russian forces made in Dobrobylia near the Pokrovsk salient right before the Alaska summit. These are infiltrations of small groups of Russian men accompanied by drones and really going and seizing positions just within and just beyond this 20-kilometer front line. And I say that because it's really important to understand that what looks like a large gain on the map isn't the maneuver of a large army, but the infiltration of a small group. The challenge is that the precision lethality brought by drones makes it very difficult for the Russians to advance and for the Ukrainians to challenge their advance. And so it is taking months to clean out the different pockets whenever the Russians end up inside of Ukrainian battle space. And then when the Ukrainians make advances, likewise through infiltrations, it can take months for them to secure their pocket. So what does this mean, really? First of all, we think here in the United States that this war is stalemated. This war is not stalemated. This war is positional. That means that these sides are competing for positions on the battlefield and are fighting for different ways to bring maneuver back to the battlefield. The second thing is that these sides will continue to test each other on the battlefield. And we do see that the Russians are bringing new techniques behind the 20-kilometer front line in order to make slightly larger advances. They must be stopped, and the Ukrainians need to up their game on mid-range strike, intermediate strike, in order to match the kinds of gains that the Russians are making. But lastly, it means that one side or another can and will win this war. I think it is vital for US national security that the Ukrainians win. I think that the innovation cycle in Ukraine is still at high tempo, and the capabilities of the forces are high. So with support from the United States and from NATO, the Ukrainian army can continue to innovate and evolve and try to break the stalemate, but certainly break Putin's narrative of victory.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay, Doug, right now, as you've already discussed, the U.S. is considering sending Tomahawk missiles via the Europeans to Ukraine. How do you see their battlefield use if they get to Ukraine? And can they be useful in kickstarting negotiations?
Well, first of all, let me just say, Prime Minister, you've frequently hosted us in Kyiv at your conference, so it's a real, I think, it's a symmetrical welcome to our consul here in Washington, so I'm glad you're here. Look, the shorthand of military assistance, shorthand story of military assistance over the last 3 years has been one of increments, right? And the Tomahawk's is the most recent increment. I don't think, and in each increment, we've reminded ourselves, there's no silver bullet, meaning that this increment won't dramatically change the battlefield dynamics. Remember, this started with javelins and stingers, right? And then we went through artillery. Then we went through tanks. Then more recently, ATACMS and F-16s. None of those has dramatically changed the battlefield. And I don't think this increment, this shiny object, if you will, on which we're now somewhat fixated, will change the battlefield dramatically. For a number of reasons. So first of all, the Ukrainians actually produce indigenously a more capable cruise missile than the Tomahawk. And they do it at about 1/10 the cost and at a higher production rate. Longer range, higher payload, not quite the sophisticated targeting that the Tomahawk has, but if I were a Ukrainian, I'd depend on my Tomahawk versus a promise from Washington. So I think the best thing we can do to change the battlefield dynamic here would be to fully fund the emerging and flourishing domestic Ukrainian defense industry. It just needs money. They're operating at less than 50% capacity today. Why don't we fund them rather than go through all this drama of sending them our systems, which frankly aren't as good and would probably come with restrictions, right? Restrictions in number and restrictions in targeting. So let's skip that step, okay? And let's fund the Ukrainians. By the way, down the road, we'll benefit from the Ukrainian defense industry. So let's put our money where it counts, which is with the Ukrainians. Now, providing Tomahawks, though, may have a value, but it's a political value. It could be the most significant symbol of a political sea change in this administration, right? So I'm less enamored with the battlefield potential of the Tomahawk than I am with the political signal that it would send, especially if it were sent in quantity and with no geographic restrictions. I don't expect that to happen.
Let me throw something at you. That was excellent. One thing that this panel has not mentioned yet is that in New York, at the meeting between Trump and Zelensky, and actually in the Oval Office, when you had the 7 European leaders there was talk about a deal between the United States and Ukraine on drone production. A deal that could be worth as much as $50 billion over 5 years. And this is exactly the logic that you just expressed. Ukraine has this extraordinary drone industry based upon everyday battlefield testing. And this would enable Ukraine to double its production of drones for their own use and for US use. And as we've seen with Russian drones entering NATO airspace, this is critical for us too. What do you think about that? Yes.
No, I think that's another case in point, right? I mean, Ukraine has a defense industry that outmatches ours. I mean, last year, public sources indicate they produced 1 million drones inside Ukraine, right? Meanwhile, our Pentagon, through the replicator program, struggles to produce a couple thousand, right? That process will continue. And by the way, the ones we produce are roughly 10 times as expensive as the Ukrainians. So what are we doing here, folks? Let's go to where the rubber meets the road, and let's invest in the defense industry inside Ukraine. It's the single best bang for the buck.
Okay.
And in fact, John, may I just add this?
Please.
The Prime Minister had mentioned victory in Ukraine. Quite frankly, it has been said time and again that investment in Ukraine's defense industry equates with victory in Ukraine. And not just victory in Ukraine, but security guarantees and its position beyond.
The single most credible security guarantee, once we have a peace, right, is indigenous Ukrainian security guarantees. I would not count on anything signed on a piece of paper by anybody else. And we have an industry here, we have a nation here that's willing to defend itself. Let's help them do it.
We are willing to defend you, so we believe that we can safeguard you in case if you make us a NATO member, so we can definitely defend every
I think you've made a compelling case.
territory.
I think you've made a compelling case for NATO membership.
You have indeed.
We'd rather fight with you than most of our other NATO allies.
And I fully share your take, General, if I may.
Please.
Fully share your take. You're absolutely right in terms of Ukraine's capacity to produce its ammo. And the thing I am just wondering about, why our Western friends didn't allow Ukraine to get cutting-edge technologies in terms of producing Ukraine's own long-range missiles? Because the thing is that everyone is deliberating that, look, it is Americans or Europeans with the Taurus who have to supply this weaponry, and Putin is just jumping on this bandwagon saying that, look, in this case, we're going to escalate with the US and blah, blah, blah. You have cutting-edge technologies, and we have an enormous capabilities and capacity to produce this. And this is the best way to pull the rug from under Putin and the rest of the world, saying that, look, it is Ukrainian-made missile. Not a Tomahawk, but Sokera, okay?
I have only one
And it
question.
works, you know?
So why
An
did,
X.
why did you name your most capable long-range cruise missile the Flamingo? It makes no sense.
So,
There must be a good reason for this. American
can
acronyms drive us
rename it.
crazy, but let's rename it. We need something more martial.
Kim, 1 minute on drones.
Yes, as you know, Ukraine has the ability to produce about 4.5 million drones. It will have produced 4.5 million drones this year. Russia has the same capability. Indeed, the limitation on Ukrainian production of drones is cash. And so I agree with my esteemed colleagues that investing in Ukraine's defense industry is an excellent investment, not only for Ukraine, but also for the United States and for the security of Europe, particularly as Putin engages in phase 0 operations to set conditions for future conflict in Europe. He is escalating in Europe with those drones that he has sent to different capitals and different airports. What I want to say, though, is that let's not knock that Tomahawk. I am all in favor of making sure that the United States and Europe invest in Ukraine's indigenous capabilities. But there's still a bridging strategy that needs to be made as Ukraine gets the capabilities that it needs and continues to stand up its defense industry. And the United States can make a meaningful difference.
Okay, thank you. All right, Mr. Prime Minister, if you could keep your answer to 3 minutes so we get to audience questions. Talking of deep strikes, Ukraine has had extraordinary success going after Russian hydrocarbon facilities because it never listened to American administrations on this, to its credit. How effective are these on upping economic pressure on Russia and even shaping the battlefield?
well, there are different numbers what's happening right now in Russia, but we can say for sure that around 20% of the refinery facilities in Russian Federation is under stress. So they are no longer capable to refine its oil. And the reason is very clear. Have you seen the latest data that Russians started to import gasoline from Belarus? There are some kind of carbs that have been imposed in Ukrainian Crimea over the gasoline on gasoline stations. So it really affects the Russian population. But I believe, John, is that we have to focus more on the Russia's ability to finance its war chest. They are still gaining enough money to prosecute the war. They are still getting hundreds of billions in revenues from hydrocarbons. So they are still getting an enormous resources from China. And I want to be once again very clear. China is an accomplice, even despite the fact that China is not providing a weaponry to, frankly, I don't know, okay? Let me put it this way. I don't know, could be. But China is providing dual-use components for Russia. And Russia is making out of these dual-use components weaponry that kills Ukrainians. And China is providing financial and military support to whom? To North Korea. And North Korea has deployed already its forces against Ukraine. So, yes, Ukraine's operations inside Russia are very successful. But my message is as follows. Please, let's not be in a complacency mode, okay? Situation is very, very complicated. Russia still has enormous resources, strong allies, and enough capacity to prosecute the war against the free world and mainly against Ukraine. So we have to be very realistic about this.
Thank you. Paula, also please, 3 minutes. Russian drones and fighter jets, as you yourself mentioned, have been playing games in NATO airspace. The Trump administration has responded to this with relative restraint. In your view, How might these latest Russian provocations, which have only gotten worse, influence the administration's decision-making? And what should we do about this problem?
Well, first, when the first incursion occurred with Poland, by the way, that coincided with the death of Charlie Kirk. And I think the administration and the president was focused on that. So, because you used the word restraint, I think his attention was in that direction. I say that because when Estonia occurred, he came right out and he called out Russia and said what had happened, what would breed trouble, and then he also offered assistance to Estonia in terms of military requests that they had asked for in dealing with, shooting down, dealing with the fighter aircraft that came over. So I think also it's worth noting there was a statement that was released by Western partners. The United States was part of that. Also our ambassador in NATO, Matthew Whitaker, also came out and reaffirmed the stance that the United States would be taking in protecting and defending the sovereignty of NATO members. So you asked, where do we go from here? Again, I think that this is a provocation that flies in the face of the very path that President Trump tried to initiate and to get some kinds of results from. He's not, and so I think you're seeing that it's going into the direction of providing assistance for those to deal with such provocations, meaning military assistance, joining forces with Europe in this case in its condemnation of such actions. And then even as we know, although he used this term earlier, but even calling Russia a paper tiger, which was not well received in Moscow. So I think you can see more of that. I will use the term again that Zelensky used, game changer. I think it is a game changer.
Okay, thank you. Doug, you're welcome to comment on that, but let me also ask you another question. There are reports in the media that we are now giving Ukraine intelligence for longer range strikes into Russia, which would be consistent with what Trump has been saying the last couple of weeks. Assuming these are true, and it looks like it's true, but we can't be certain, how do you see the strategy behind this?
Well, first of all, I don't think that our intelligence for the deeper strikes, and here we're talking basically about strikes on Russian territory, right? Beyond the front line, beyond the occupied territories. We shouldn't discount the Ukrainian intelligence capability. I mean, their capability on the ground is much better than ours.
Right.
But we can supplement their human intelligence with signals intelligence and geospatial intelligence, satellite-based intelligence, and so forth in a very helpful way. And we should do that. First of all, it's low profile politically, so it's not debated in the halls of Congress and so forth. It doesn't cost that much, and it could be done in complete safety with our forces. I think that we ought to focus that intelligence sharing, however, on two vulnerabilities that are inescapable for the Russian occupying forces. First of all, behind this 20-kilometer zone, Kim's 20-kilometer zone, right, is a low-grade army. This is not Patton's Third Army in World War II. They're coerced into service, they're poorly led, they're poorly supplied, they're poorly trained. Many of them don't even know what they're doing there, right? This is an army ready to crack. This is an army that is fragmentable. Second vulnerability, they're largely dependent on railroads for resupply. This is a traditional, long-standing, generation-standing Russian method of logistics, railroads. So you've got a low-grade army dependent on a vulnerable resupply system. Think the Kerch Strait Bridge, for example, but there are land railroads, on land as well. If we can interdict those railroads and put increasing pressure on this low-grade army, Putin may face what other Russian leaders historically have sometimes faced, which is the collapse of a battlefield army. That would change the dynamics, the political dynamics in the Kremlin, because he'd then be fighting for his life. So I would like to focus this intelligence and focus the long-range strikes on those two vulnerabilities, low-grade army, railroad logistics.
Problems with logistics is why Russia lost the first war, Crimean War, in the
Right.
19th century.
Exactly.
Kim?
I'd love to pick up on that because I
Please.
had the privilege of keynoting the Brave One conference in Lviv about a month ago and talked about what's happening in that distance between 20 kilometers behind the line and 100 kilometers behind the line. Really attempted to make the case that Ukraine, although it is right to conduct long-range strikes on Russian targets, as it is doing, Ukraine must also conduct strikes in this 20 to 100 kilometer range, which is exactly where the logistics hubs, the headquarters, the depots, et cetera, that are allowing the Russians actually to stage essentially in a sanctuary 20 kilometers behind the line and then send infiltrators forward. What I think is so important here is that the Russians, I don't know that the Russian army can be collapsed through battlefield air interdiction of its railroads, but I do think that the Ukrainians can achieve coherent and cogent effects and push the Ukrainians back from the 20-kilometer line back to 40 or 60 or 80 kilometers in a way that means that they can't do their little infiltrations and they can't reinforce them by ground. This is actually really important because it will require the Russians actually to change the way that they are fighting the war and give Ukraine time and space actually to create its own, frankly, counteroffensive operations. This is super important, but it's technologically difficult, and Ukraine needs help investing in the resources for mid-range strike in a cost-effective way. And there are super-duper people who are thinking about this in Ukraine, but there's a lot that can be done with the development of the core system to create the command and control that is necessary for this kind of battlefield effect.
Okay, I'm going to really test you right now. Try and answer this in 90 seconds.
90.
The relative ability of the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces to continue the war at this current pace of operations.
Both sides have the capability to continue.
At the current pace.
Pardon?
At the current energetic pace.
At the current pace, yes. What we're seeing is the Russians replenishing at the current pace. We are seeing the Ukrainians substitute unmanned systems for manpower in order to be able to continue at the current pace. And I do actually think that both sides will continue this way at this tempo for a year or more.
Okay, we've got about 15 minutes for questions. For those asking questions virtually, go to ac.org, but we'll privilege the folks in the room. So hands up. Okay, we had a question over here.
If the person could identify.
Michael, it's good to see you.
John, if the person could identify him or
Yes, please identify yourself.
Michael Washura, I'm with The Insider. How long do all of you expect this war to continue? And I've been hearing for 3.5, close to 4 years now, that the Ukrainians can win if. Putin will stop fighting if. And none of those ifs ever happen. And to be fair, I'll say 2033. But what's your expectation for when all of these ifs will actually come together and this ends?
Okay, if everyone's going to get an answer on this, 60 seconds each. Mr. Prime Minister.
Well, let me rephrase your question. What needs to be done to win this war and to stop this war? Because for how long is an implication, you know? And I've already told you what needs to be done. We urgently need to get the real breakthrough. So as of now, we have more or less similar capacity on both sides to prosecute the war. But we need to get the breakthrough. So we need to get an additional ammo, cutting-edge technologies in order to fend off Russians and to get the real ceasefire. That's my answer. When it's going to take, it depends on the decision-making process in DC and in the European Union.
Okay, good and economical answer.
My answer is a very brief one. I think the war should have already been won. Quite frankly, why? Because I think there was indecision when this portion broke out, where that assistance was not provided immediately to Ukraine from the United States, from also Europe. As the term was used, and even this institution, the Atlantic Council, had spoken of it, where there was a slow rolling actually, and a concern about escalation, which you mentioned earlier, and also the reluctance on the part of those officials at the time who were not willing to go for a victory. I think that's changed. That was in a previous administration, and I think there's another kind of movement now. We should be able, with these provocations, actually to regain the momentum here.
Okay, another question in the room over here. Viola, and please identify yourself, and then we'll go to our virtual attendees.
Viola Ganger from Just Security. What is Russia learning from its incursions into Eastern Europe?
Kim, you want to try that?
I'll take it. I think Russia is learning that Europe is reluctant, actually, to recognize Putin is a tester. Okay, when we look at the way Putin has behaved in international relations throughout his tenure, Putin tests and then Putin goes. So this is a test of the European defensive system. It is a test to see whether European states will actually respond with force to defend the air sovereignty of Europe. And I think that Putin is waiting to see whether Europe actually responds to that test with something other than statements, because in my assessment, certainly this is an Article 5 violation, not something that should result in an Article 4 consultation. And I think that it would be wise for the United States and European countries actually to stop Putin's escalation quickly and now, rather than giving him the running room by which he pushes and pushes.
Doug, you want to add to this?
Yeah, just from a NATO perspective, he's going to look at the actions NATO takes, not the communiques, not the joint press statements, not what the Secretary General says at the podium, right? And so far, he can't be impressed. I mean, the most heavily defended airspace in Europe today is Ukraine, right? I mean, there's no NATO airspace as well defended as Kyiv. And the other major cities, and even that, you can see what happens when those air defenses are overwhelmed. So NATO's got a long way to go. They made some promising announcements. I haven't seen anything moving on the ground yet. So I think he'll watch and see very carefully what actions are taken. Do the rules of engagement change in the Baltic air policing mission? Does it become an air defense mission and not just an escort intruders outside of national airspace? Does it become more than that? And I haven't seen that. I haven't seen the details. Now, it's also fair to say that NATO wouldn't advertise those details at this stage until they're ready, right? So I think your term learning is probably still underway.
I would agree with that, but I'd add two other elements. I think also part of it was to test and see the unity of NATO. Because there's been some dissension about what if something happens, what do we do, etc. And then the second is intel gathering in this case, which also many of the countries, Poland, Estonia, speak to this. And then finally, I'll say, quite frankly, for some of the countries, it's not anything new. Up at the United Nations, the Estonian president said, we had this incursion. We've had it for like 86 times. Who's counting? You know, we deal with this, and no less had the cyber attack. So I would just point that out as well.
So he is not learning, he is testing. He is testing Article 5, Article 4. He is testing the reaction of the Oval Office. He is testing military protocols, and he is testing the way the NATO is to respond. He's collecting an intelligence, and you know what he is testing? He is testing the population in the European Union. What would be the reaction of both politicians and Europeans? Because it's a kind of scaremongering. So the message he is sending is as follows. I am to make and further incursions. I will attack you unless you abandon Ukraine. And and he's just trying to get the sense whether you are, I mean, the free world is real in supporting Ukraine. And in my humble opinion, the best response to these kind of incursions would be to provide an air shield for Ukraine, or no-fly zone over Ukraine. That's the language Putin understands. All of the rest is just cheap talk.
Let me just add that NATO so far has not passed this test, but there's one NATO member who has passed this test. And it was 10 years ago when the Russians sent their air force into Turkish territory for no more than 10 or 20 seconds a shot. The fourth time they did it, the Turks shot it down, and problem ended. Okay, we have a question from our virtual audience from, and forgive me if I mispronounce your first name, Satyendra Gupta. And Mr. Prime Minister, we'll give this to you. With NATO and the EU now backing Ukraine more strongly and putting tougher energy sanctions on Russia, how do you envisage the shift affecting the strategic autonomy of non-aligned countries like India? Oh.
So, is NATO and the European Union supporting Ukraine? Yes, NATO, European Union supporting Ukraine. Regarding the United States, I believe once again that we strongly welcome the message of the President of the United States, but we need to get real deliverables. Actions have to be taken. And these kind of deliverables are very clear. Ammo, financial support, security supplemental, and additional secondary sanctions, and to scrutinize the effectiveness of current sanctions. In terms of India, as an honorable gentleman mentioned India, with all due respect to the idea to impose sanctions on India, I would provide a stick and carrot policy towards India. So to incentivize India to get rid of the Russian dependence on both of oil and Russian ammo, to provide the long credit lines for India, to substitute Russian oil with an American one. Look, it's a huge market. It's tens of billions of dollars. So, and it's better for your administration to get along with Modi and somehow to have him on board instead of pushing him closer to Russia and closer to China.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go back to our audience here. And I think Mr. Ponomaryov has a question.
Yeah, Ilya Ponomarev. My question is, we're talking here about the war, ending war in Ukraine, and as much as I wish it, my question is, do you think it would actually increase the chances of war in Eastern Europe or decrease them?
Okay, I think all of our panels will want to answer this. I should mention, though, Ilya just gave you his name. He's the only member of the Duma in Russia that voted against annexing Crimea. Okay. Kim, we'll start with you. Just walk this way.
I'm actually going to pass. Go ahead.
Okay. Doug?
So my sense is if Putin wins in Ukraine, if Ukraine falls, right, it's a much higher risk to Eastern Europe and to NATO allies. So I think this is why I think most of the panel, I can't speak for the panel, we think this is a vital interest, not only for the United States of America, but for NATO and the security of Europe. And the security of Europe, in turn, is hinges on how well we can do elsewhere, right? So, I mean, I think this is absolutely vital.
Paula?
I would agree. I don't really have a further point to add on that.
The only way to stop neo-imperial ambitions of Russia is to make Ukraine to win this war, period. And the same goes with China. If Ukraine wins, Chinese will double-check their actions, and all another dictators. They will realize that, look, there will be a very high price to pay for any kind of violation of international law.
Steve Biegun was Deputy Secretary of State in the first Trump administration. He says wisely that there's not one problem around the world confronting the United States that would not be better off if Putin loses this war in Ukraine. And I would just add to that, there's no country in Europe better able to defend itself against Russian aggression than Ukraine. This is the place to make Putin lose.
Thank you.
John, may I don't know if we have another question, but
Go ahead.
may I inject something?
Sure.
I
This will
mentioned
be the
to
final
you,
word.
I carried with me Bruce Stokes, who is with the German Marshall Fund. Sorry, I'm citing a competitor.
No, we
in here.
work with the German Marshals.
Okay.
We love them.
Okay, so he worked with the Pew on a kind of a poll. I just wanted to mention a few things because it was focused particularly on Republicans and particularly those supporting Trump. Not just MAGA, but Republicans in general. And just a few I want to mention. It says half the American public favors paying less attention to problems overseas, including 2/3 of Republicans. Again, these could be challenged, but I felt like sharing them. Let me just go to a couple more that relate to. Americans' views of Russia are worse than they have been since the fall of the Soviet Union. I thought that was an interesting one here in terms of the readout. Less than 3 in 10 Republicans worry about Russia's military threats to Ukraine or Europe. Nevertheless, 6 in 10 Americans back additional military aid to Ukraine, and for the first time in 2 years, this includes half of Republicans. And the last
Paula,
one,
just to be clear,
Yeah.
aid means actual American assistance, like gifts,
Right.
quote unquote.
yes, yes. And then 3 in 4 Americans have a negative view of China, even more negative than views after Tiananmen. I thought I'd mention that one, given what you had said about China. I understand the Atlantic Council will be having a discussion and a survey or a program coming up that's going to look
On
at some.
Thursday, I believe.
Okay.
Friday.
That's
But-
a perfect survey for those who want to win midterms. In the US, right?
It could be, but here it is. Americans' views of Trump, trade, and foreign policy. The Pew Charitable Trust.
Look, there's an underlying assumption about the Russian military that I think is actually dangerous. And the underlying assumption is that Russia will simply rebuild its army to its pre-2022 capacity before taking any military action in Europe. That is not a sound assumption. It is one hypothesis of how Russia may behave. But the Russians actually have new military capability that they're bringing to bear on the battlefield in Ukraine. And what is holding them back from bringing that capability to bear elsewhere in Europe is the Ukrainian armed forces and the defense of Ukraine's skies. The Russian military is adapting and it is changing. And it has capabilities in drones, in Shaheds, brought to larger scale production by North Korea and China in ways that actually make it a threat to Europe in the near term, whether or not it is, impaled on Ukraine. So I think we can be too dismissive of Russian capabilities. And we really, I don't want to overstate Russia's capabilities, but I think Americans may underestimate the damage that that Putin can bring to bear. And it's why it's so important to take seriously the phase 0 war, the precondition setting that Putin is doing to bring war to Europe, either after he finishes with Ukraine or when he is ready.
So we shouldn't underestimate,
No,
but we shouldn't overestimate.
correct.
Remember that the invasion army of 2022 was the product of a decade-long investment program by Putin, right? And our intelligence services and others got their quality factor wrong, right? And that army, by the way, it no longer exists. It's been destroyed in Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that Russia is without means to threaten Europe,
Correct.
right? Its air and missile capabilities are being displayed almost every night in Ukraine. And Europe is largely defenseless right now against that.
drone capabilities.
And its drone capabilities. It is much further along in the drone innovation scale than we are, or any NATO ally is. So they have learned a lot there. But their ground army is also, and this is, I think, maybe a point you want to close on, John. Armies reflect societies, right? So the Russian army is drawn from Russian society, just as the Ukrainian army or the American army, right? And fundamentally, the army that's occupying Ukraine today reflects Russian society. It is top-down driven, it is corrupt, it's self-abusive, right? And so in the long run, I give every benefit to the Ukrainian army because on every measure of quality, because of the reflection of society, on every measure of quality, so leadership, innovation, and so forth, the Ukrainian army beats the Russian army. So this is very much a debate, a contest between quality and quantity. And I believe this is an instance where a higher quality army will beat a larger army.
And that's why 30 seconds for the first question of the gentleman when he asked, what do we see it? Is it going to end? How's it going to end? And why I said it could have ended before, because if the Ukrainian military had been provided with what they wanted, we're talking about years ago, the last administration, I believe they would have won.
And before the last administration, too.
And before that, too.
Yeah. Mr. Minister, your last word is yours.
Well, we have to be realistic. Russia is still a very huge power, with the nukes, with the military, with the allies, with China, and with another axis of evils. Russia and China wants to reshape the global order, and the Ukrainian military is fighting against this monster. Well, President Trump could name it as a paper tiger. Maybe it's a drunk, crazy bear. But this is the real monster. And we can win this fight only with your support. And my message to you, and I kindly request you, as noble representatives of the US political establishment, we still enjoy a bipartisan support. Look at this Senate bill on the secondary sanctions. It grabbed around 84 or 85 senators. So, Paula, you just mentioned the very high numbers for the Ukraine support in the United States. It is in your vital national security interests to make Ukraine to win this war. You're gonna win too.
And with that, I'd like to thank our guests from Kyiv and our wonderful panelists as well. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you, John.